Hi, this is Alex from PHP Academy and welcome to this CSS tutorial on shadows. Now in this tutorial we're going to be looking at the box shadow property. We're going to be creating some shadows on an element in our browser. So really just testing out this feature. It's a great new feature of CSS3. Obviously this series is covering general CSS, but it wouldn't be complete without shadows, because shadows can add a lot of depth to a page, make it look really nice. Anyway, we'll go ahead and create our container. We'll start starting up inside of our primary.css file. We'll go through the box shadow property and we'll look at what values we can give it. We're not going to go through any long properties or anything. We're just going to go ready to use, and it's going to be you'll be able to take from this video, learn how to use it, what values we need to pass it and everything. And there is one thing with regards to the color of the shadow that doesn't quite render properly in WebKit. So we've got Safari then and Chrome. If we don't specify a color value for the shadow, it won't appear. So that's one thing we need to bear in mind. Alright, let's go ahead and create our container. As usual, we'll go for our div with an ID of container, and let's go ahead and just place some content in there. Now I'm going to go ahead and just start to style this up. So with regards to the container, we'll give it a width of 100, a height of 100. We'll give it a margin just so we can pull it away from the edge of the page very slightly. And we'll go ahead and give it some padding. So we'll give it a 10 pixel padding inside, and we'll also give it a background, which is important so we can sort of see what we're doing. I'm going to give it a background of CCC, and what that will do is it'll allow me to get this nice light grey colour, and I can nicely then, or see very nicely the border, or the shadow, sorry, around the outside. So we've got our container. Now let's go ahead and start to style up with using box shadow. Okay, so box shadow, it takes, the property name is just box shadow, quite simple. Now the values that we need to pass through to this are first of all the horizontal offset, then the vertical offset. Now, what does this mean? Well, an offset is, telling it does, horizontally, i.e. the x-axis, which way does it move, or how does it move, or how far does it move, and the same then with a vertical. So what we need to do is we need to specify, how we offset it. Now, if you wanted, say, a border to be sort of sunlight driven, if you know what I mean. So if the sunlight of your page, if you like, was coming from this side, you wouldn't want a shadow around here, you'd want the shadow around these edges here. So hopefully that makes sense. That's how shadows look in real life. So we might want to offset it slightly to this way. So we'd offset it, say, 5 pixels horizontally, and would offset it, say, 5 pixels vertically. So then we'll have sort of this shadow that's, as if light's casting on top of it. So we'll do that first, and then we'll look at setting these values to 0 and how we can get some cool effects out of this. So I'll show you a few different effects that we can achieve with this, blah blah blah. So let's say offset this 5 pixels horizontally, and let's set this 5 pixels vertically. Now what we've got is two optional values here. So what we'll do now is we'll just cut this short. In fact, no, sorry, we won't cut it short, we'll specify the colour. So let's go ahead and say black. Okay, so we'll set that to black. Let's go ahead and look how this is rendered. Well, now we can see we've got a shadow. Okay, it's not quite a nice looking shadow, there's no blur, there's no distance for this, anything like that. So it's not looking too nice, but we do have a shadow still. It's not part of this element, it's not added any markup to it, but we now have a nice looking shadow around the outside. So what do we want to do? Well, now let's go ahead and look at the two optional properties that we have. Now the optional properties we have are the blur distance and the spread distance. So we can blur and then spread the shadow as well. It's almost like when you're using graphics design software, so any graphics design software, you would expect to be able to change these values, but we can now do this in CSS. So with one line of code, we can change these the blur of something. So this means no more images, no more uploading and loading images in. So let's go ahead and give this a blur. So I'll give it a blur of, we'll change that slightly just so we can determine which one's which. We'll give it a blur of 6 pixels, and we won't change the distance. We'll do this first and then see how it looks. So back to our browser, let's refresh. You can see that's very slightly blurred, so it's made the shadow look a lot more natural, a lot more like an actual shadow rather than just a hit point or a sharp point of the shadow. Now let's take a look at setting a spread. So I'm going to go for we'll go for 8 pixels. So when we refresh now, you'll notice that the difference here is that we have spread the shadow out. Obviously this looks a bit odd because I've given it a bit too high a value. Let's choose 3 pixels for that. And there we go, we've sort of spread the shadow out a bit. So what we've done is with a spread, it might be quite hard to determine what this value does as opposed to these two values. A spread will enlarge the area that the shadow covers. It won't change the offset, but it'll enlarge the area that it covers. But really, if you're enlarging the spread by anything, you need to enlarge the blur. That's going to give it more of a blur, so it's going to look a bit better. But by all means, play around with these values. They're great to mess around with and change values with. And remember, you can do it using the browser. So this is the beauty of using the element inspector in Chrome or Firebug if you're using Firefox. You can go ahead and you can change these values. You can, I'm pressing the up and down arrow on my key and it's brilliant. I can just go ahead and set the blur, change the blur here. So I could change the blur to say 30 pixels, get rid of that altogether. And you see it's created like a blur around thing. It doesn't look very good, but this is the point. We can play around with it here. The other thing we can play around with is colors. We can set AAA. That's sort of like a more natural blur to this. If I was to set this to about 10, we've got sort of like a nice natural looking blur. The possibilities are endless. You could mess around with this all day just to achieve the effect you want. But the perfect thing about this is if you need to go back and say, oh, actually I want that blur to be a bit more. You don't have to go and upload another photo. You don't have to load up your photo editor and and change it. You can just go and do it in the markup. It's brilliant using this. So that's the basics of box shadow. We've just covered essentially what you need to create a shadow on an element. Remember, we've got the horizontal offset, the vertical offset, so the X and Y. And by the way, these can take minus figures. So if I was to say -5, and we refresh, you see that goes to the other side of the element. The same with the vertical as well. We can change that so it goes above the element as well. So we don't need to have a positive offset, we can have a negative offset. We've got the blur value, and then we've got the spread of the shadow. So a great property in CSS. Play around with it, change the colors, change all these values, and remember these two are optional.